I have a white Prismacolor pencil here. And I recently have figured out how to use this to even greater effect in for creating masking effects. And I want to just demonstrate that for everybody here. And then it'll be part of your bag of tricks. So the Prismacolor pencil technique, this also works with crayon. This also works with, this is a Faber Castell Polychromos pencil. So I'll do it with these two pencils here. Oh, I should mention that a little bit yesterday, I was drawing with this Prismacolor pencil, and what happened is the entire lead inside of it became loose, and as I would start to write, it would push out the back of my pencil. It was attached nowhere inside, and I've had the same problem happen to several Prismacolor pencils. It doesn't seem that they're firmly attached inside. So the way that I solved that is that I pulled the tip out, so partially about that far, and just got some glue and put it with a toothpick down the back of the pencil and then slid this back in and then let that dry. And so now it is back to working again. So if that does happen to you, you can just pull your lid out a little bit more, drop glue down into the end where you are not writing, and then push the lid back, get it all flush, and you can kind of glue your Prismacolor pencils back together. That doesn't happen with Polychromos pencils. The Polychromos pencils are glued in all the way along their length, which is a nice feature of them. But if it does happen with your Prismacolor pencils, you now know what to do. So here is kind of what we knew before. Waxy pencils do not, they make a surface that's kind of a little bit of a resist, where when you put watercolor on top of them, the white will show through. And let's just sort of take a look at how this looks. I'll show you the limitation of it that I thought was there before and what I have now discovered. So let's say I'm going to draw, actually what I'll do is I'll make a little grid here. And we'll zoom down on that. No, we won't. We'll do this. Right. So here is, in this column is going to be the Polychromos. That's the Faber Castell pencils. And in the next category will be the Prismacolor. And what I'm going to do with my Polychromos pencil is I am going to make several marks and fill in a little area. And I'll make several marks and fill in a little area. I'm going to do the same thing with, so why does it look, why can't you see anything? Well, because it's a white pencil on white paper. If I look at this page a little bit from the side, I can tell where I have made my marks because there's a different sort of sheen in the paper. See the little bit of pencil that just popped off there? That tends not to happen really as much with Polychromos pencils. But this is sort of the thing that happens a lot with the Prismacolor pencils. You'll be drawing with it on little fragments like this will chip off. All right, so I have some marks marked. And what I'm going to do is I am going to take some paint and paint over those. So I'm getting a rather dark paint here. This is in Durer blue. There we go. Now, as you look down on this, you may not be very impressed by our results and effect here. As a matter of fact, you know, if we look at where I have made these marks with the white pencil, in some places right up here, you see it as a little white line. Now you're seeing that white line because there is the paint is not adhering to where the wax marks of the pencil are. So you see this blotch over here. That's where I made kind of a blotch with the pencil. Over in here, you see these two as pale lines. The third one over here, you actually see as a dark mark because I pressed so hard that I made a groove in the paper, and that groove is now filled up with paint. But if I, so what I'm going to do is just sort of make this coat a little bit lighter. There we go. I'm going to move it around a little bit more. And you can see that you're seeing a little bit of those. This is what we kind of knew before, right? That if you paint on colored pencil, the paint doesn't really adhere to the paper very well. But in a moment, we're going to take this to a much more interesting and nuanced level. What I'm also going to do is just make a little dark mark over here, some Dathrone blue, put that down on my paper, and I'm going to let all of this business dry. While this business is drying, we're going to hop over to one of our we're going to go take a look at what the thoughts are over in the chat. And don't worry, this trick right now, this is interesting, but it's about to get really, really interesting. So this is stuff that I've shown you before, but we're going to really make that much more interesting. Let's see here. Well, while that's drying, why don't we address this idea? While this is drying, let's address the idea of colored pencils and colored pencil types and watercolor pencils, and what the deal is there. This is still too wet for me to mess with, so I'm just going to let it dry there. But you see those patterns starting to kind of show through. Interesting, but again, we knew that before. Meantime, let's take a look at 3 types of pencils. First up, we have Prismacolor pencils. Prismacolor pencils come in a gazillion shades. And if you, so these are all Prismacolor pencils, right? So they make a pencil for just about every hue out there. And there are so many, what I find is really useful to do is to organize them just sort of by color groups. So here's all my purples and blues. Rather than hunting around in a box, I just kind of fan this out and I can pick the right one. It's easy to get back in. If you put them back into that big carton that they come with, then what happens is that you, the ones that you use the most get shorter fast. And so when you put them back into the box, they disappear behind the lip of the box and they're hard to get out. So the pencils that you use the most become the most inaccessible pencils to you. So I've grouped these sort of by color groups. You don't need to get the full jumbo set of all these colors. At one point I thought I did, so that's why I still have them. But the reason that you don't is that when you're using colored pencils, the best kind of approach to it is, let me sort of show you something cool. We've explored this before, but with colored pencils, you get your best and your most interesting results by, here I am, let's go down on that, right there. Here I am making some marks, getting my color across the paper. Especially if you have a small set of colored pencils, you're probably not going to be able to pick up a color that is exactly the color that you want. And even if you can, if you color things, an area in just with one pencil, it's often not as visually interesting as if you're mixing pencils. So what I do for best colored pencil effects is I will layer colors on top of each other. Notice this time I'm going in a different direction. Before I was going in this direction. Now I've switched my directions. And because I'm going in a different direction, the paper still has a lot of tooth. And we can get color next to color. All right? And I've just changed my color. Notice that there's still a lot of white paper here sparkling through. That's good. I want that. The more that I have those other colors just sort of shining through like that, that's going to allow me to then add more colors on top of that. And now I'm going to go in a third direction. You can build colors and build colors and build colors with colored pencils. As long as you maintain that tooth of the paper, when you see those little white sparkles, you know you're still able to put more colors into there. Now I'm going to get some grape down here on the bottom. And the colors that you make by mixing things together are visually they kind of sparkle back with all of these different colors. And it's visually much more interesting. So I recommend that when you are playing with your colored pencils, try that. And you're going to find that you really are able to build much more interesting colors. When you get to the point where, yes, this is the color that I want, you stop. And you can either leave it with that white sparkling through. I really like that approach. I think it's neat to kind of see that, oh, this is a colored pencil drawing, and there's some of the texture of your colored pencil. But sometimes, if you're drawing something that's really smooth and you want this to be a really smooth coat of color, then you're going to want to handle that slightly differently. So let me show you what to do. You can either leave it with the sparkles. So I'm going to leave part of this with sparkles. So this part here, I'm going to leave with the sparkles. Next to it, in this part here, I'm going to take a white colored pencil, and I'm going to just start blending these things together. And you notice as this happens that those sparkles are starting to go away. They're starting to kind of get smoothed out, blended out. The whole thing is paler because I have put white pencil on top of it also. But also just notice how now it's this very smooth section of color. But noticeably paler than what's on either side, right? That's because I added white to it. But sort of, you end up with this pastel of it, but it turns it nice and creamy and smooth. If I want to add more colors on top of this, I have flattened this paper out so much, there's no more tooth in it, it's going to be really hard to do. So adding the white pencil would be one of the last things that I would do. An alternate to that is what's called the colorless blender. So a colorless blender is just wax and no pigment in it. So this is just wax. So I could use this the same way, and I'm going to do that in this third area. So this area I'm just going to leave as is. This area over here I'm going to do with white. Take a look at what you get with the Colorless Blender. And you'll see that this also smooths, but it doesn't turn it pastel. Isn't that a cool trick? So that Colorless Blender, that's a neat toy. And a good little addition to your colored pencil approach. This stuff is still not quite dry. I got carried away putting on too much water. The next time I use my Colorless Blender, if you take a look at the tip of it, there's a little bit of purple on the tip of it. And so as I start to kind of go into some yellow and start blending that, sometimes see how that purple came down on my paper right there? Knowing that before I go into my next area, what I'll do is just on the side of my paper somewhere, I will just take my colorless blender for a spin until I see that the tip of it is clear. And that gets, then it is clear and ready to go into my next little coloring zone. So know that your colorless blender can pick up a little bit of gunk on its tip. And then you bring that into, let's say if I was blending a yellow with it, I would be sad. But I can avoid that by first dropping off those colors before I go. Advantages of Prismacolor. Number one, they're less expensive. Number two, there's a huge variety of color. Number three, there's a reasonable quality to them. For your sort of the least expensive pencils you'll get, there's not a lot of pigment and there's lots of binder, the stuff that holds it together. So when you're putting down color, you don't get really bright, vibrant, saturated colors. So that's why really inexpensive pencils often kind of can mess with you. You can't make really vibrant, rich colors because they're mostly binder. So Prismacolor has got a really reasonable amount of binder, a good balance of binder to pigment in it. Disadvantages, one I mentioned earlier, sometimes the whole pencil inside it gets loose from the shaft of the wood and will start to slide out. And when that happens, you just need to, as I mentioned before, hold it out a little bit, add glue inside the barrel, push it back in, and then let that glue dry. Another disadvantage is that the tips can be rather brittle. So sometimes when you start to draw with them, oh, do you hear that? You start to draw, and oh, see that? You get these pieces breaking off. I was actually pushing way too hard just because I wanted to get that effect. They don't always do that. But they tend to be a little bit more brittle, especially if the tip of it at a micro level, sort of if this were perfectly chiseled, it would be a little point like that. But sometimes what you get is there would be a section that is kind of broken off in there like that. And now when you put pressure on the tip here, it's going to cause another hunk to flake off there. And then you press here, and it'll cause another flake to chunk off there. So sometimes when you start to draw with one of these pencils, it'll go snap, 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 snap. What you had was a nice new sharpened pencil. And immediately after starting to draw, these little pieces are flaking off. And that can be very frustrating. There is a way to fix that. Let me sharpen this pencil and show it to you. Let's take a look at the shape of this tip. And yeah, as I suspected, it's not a perfect cone. It's a little bit lopsided, you can see there. So as I start to draw on this, that lopsided zone there is going to cause a little bit of a snap. So before I start drawing, what I do is I just take it and I go for a spin. So I spin it on the piece of paper like that, and what that is doing is smoothing this point out to a nice new tip. I now have a little tip. It's nice and sharp, and it's not going snap, snap, snap on me. That's a way around that little snap, snap, snap thing. Another problem you may find is that you sharpen your pencil and then a whole section of lead comes out. So you've sharpened it to a point, and then you start to draw with it, and then this whole little section, like maybe a centimeter or two, will come out of the tip, leaving this big hollow gap behind. And then you sharpen it again, and then the same thing keeps happening. What has happened is that pencil is broken several places inside, and you're just sharpening it down to reveal those. If this pencil falls on the ground, it can get broken inside. And so one way of that sometimes works to fix that is you put your pencil into a microwave oven for just a few seconds, let it warm up, and then press on the tip. And it's going to press those warm, partially melted wax pieces back together. If you leave it in there too long, the wax inside will melt and you'll be sad. Another thing you can do if there's a big section that comes out is put a little bit of glue around it and slide it back in. The Polychromos pencils are made by Faber Castell. They're a little bit more expensive. And these pencils have really rich, buttery colors that cover very, very nicely. And I really like the feeling that I get from using them. They will make marks really nice and saturated. And they also are glued all the way through the shaft of the pencil, so you don't have chunks coming out. Also, the tip of them is harder so that they don't get dull quite as fast as the Prismacolor pencil. So they're a good kind of all-around pencil, but they are a little bit more expensive, and they don't have quite the same range of colors. Colors like black grape and grayed lavender, which are a few of my favorites to use in the Prismacolor pencil world. There are not matches for those in the Faber Castell world. A third type of pencil are watercolor pencils. These are Faber Castell Albrecht Durer pencils, and you can tell them when you pick one up. The Polychromos ones, which are the ones we were just looking at before, have a round barrel, and the Albrecht Durer ones have angles on them. You can use watercolor pencils just like a regular colored pencil. So I can put it down and it covers like a colored pencil. And then if I put another color on top of that, going in a slightly different direction, you can, just as we did before, you can build up to all sorts of rich and interesting colors. Like the other pencils, you can, if you cover them with a white pencil, you can kind of smear things down so that they're smooth. So they work just like the other pencils. But they also do this interesting thing of being, well, water-soluble, which means that when I get them wet, the pigment in them turns to liquid, and I can paint with it. That's really fun. So it's now taken all those colors, blended them together, and I have this watercolor-like effect here. But here are some things that are kind of confusing about it. Let's say I took this color here and I put it down. And now let's get another color and put it on top of this. The color that I put on top in this mixture, you're seeing more of that because, well, it's on top. If I had put this one down first and then put this one on top of it, notice how different those two colors are. And both of those were done with this same two pencils. So one, I have the brown, this maroon, sort of magenta-y maroon color underneath. That's here. And the other one, I have this cyan more underneath. And those two colors look really different. So depending on how I'm layering these up as I'm getting them, I get very different looking colors. And then if I add water to it, on this one, I get this. And so notice that this color of purple is slightly different than this color that was here. And let's do that same thing over here. Yep, same thing there. So the color that you see pre-water can be very different than the color that you get post-water. Things will be brighter, and that can be really, really confusing. So my general approach with these pencils is, also one other detail is, let's say I had little details worked in on a drawing, and then I put the water on it, all my details are going to disappear. So the general strategy is when you are drawing with these, or coloring things with these pencils, let's say I had a leaf of some sort that was here, and let's throw in some yellows with that. I don't want to put in any, at the start of a drawing, I don't want to put in any detail because all those details are going to get destroyed when I'm coming along and doing this. Okay. Any details that I put in would have been lost. So what I recommend, and also the color and the hue of this thing, the hue and the brightness of it, whether are also going to change. Things often get much more pale when you add in that water. It'll get brighter and it will get more pale. So expect when you hit it with your water that there will be these big changes, especially if you're layering more than one color. So my strategy generally is to have a very simple first coat, put that down, then let it dry, and then come back on top of it with those pencils and redraw over it. Now you'll be drawing on top of a coat that kind of already is put in some base coat of color, and then you can start altering it from there. But I don't recommend doing a complete drawing, working out all your shadows, all that other sort of stuff, then adding water to it, or it just turns really gunky, really messy, really fast. So I'm going to let this dry. And while it's doing that, I'm going to go back to what we started earlier and show you part 2 of the trick. So one thing to know, so this side was Polychromos, this side here was Prismacolor. Let's just sort of see which one of those is more opaque. This is interesting. Take a look at this. So this is, if I've drawn something and I just want to put some white details on top of it, on top of super dry paint, don't do this when your paper is wet. But with the Polychromos, here is my line. With my Prismacolor, isn't that interesting? The Prismacolor is much more opaque than the Polychromos. I didn't know that earlier, and found myself, I just kind of said to myself, I just love the Polychromos because they're just so nice and buttery and easy to work with. But what I wasn't paying attention to is just how opaque they are. So if I'm putting something on tan or gray toned paper and I want it to really pop, I'm not going to reach for this pencil. I'm going to reach for this one, my Prismacolor pencil. Now, let me show you this cool new trick. As I've mentioned before, putting more paint on top of these is going to be difficult. These things are kind of working as a resist. But look at this. I'm going to, here in my little chart, this is my eraser. Look at what happens if I let my paper get totally dry and I come in here with an eraser on top. Ooh. All right, some sneaky, yeah. It's not taking things down to bedrock, but I can get in here and I am erasing. Now I'm erasing more, pressing harder. And look at in these little chips that are coming out, there's all that blue that's coming out. A bunch of that is coming off of the stuff that is on top of that paper. So that's what it did on Polychromos. And on Prismacolor, look at that. So it's, if you look at it, it is a little bit, it's not pure white paper again. There's a little bit of kind of grain that is still in it. But I've been, by then erasing on top of where the pencil was, I've really popped these back. Something though to notice about it, if you kind of look over here on my desk, see all those little chips? Part of that is paint. Part of that is eraser fragments, and part of that is bits of paper that have come off. So take a look right in, we'll kind of zoom down more. Look at this, right in here. I'm going to just erase in here, and I want you to notice how when I do that, the eraser is also going to be making this area of paper where I'm erasing a little bit more pale. It's taking up you see that little pale spot that I just made right in there? This little ghosty pale spot is because my eraser also picked up some paint from this surface. So I now have gotten these things back to be paler, but there's also, if you notice, there's kind of a ghosty halo of extra pale zone around where I did all that erasing, because the erasing also erased some watercolor off the top of the surface of the paper. But check this out. This is a fragment of a rubber cement pickup. So this came as a big square block. All right, came as a big square block, and I've cut it into 3 strips because I now have one in my sketch bag, one in my studio, and one I'm saving to when I lose one of these. So you can get a chunk of this. I could also cut this in half this way. You could, it comes in a box about this big. So, you know, you could feed your whole family by just taking one of these things and cutting it up into little pieces. I think that's more practical than having the great big block. So I could cut this again here, and that would be plenty for me. But look at what happens when I do the same thing, but with this rubber cement pickup instead of my soft nylon eraser. On the Polychromos. This is interesting. I wonder if it's a paper thing. On this type of paper, wow, here, oh yuck. This is really interesting to me. I actually had tested this before on a different type of paper. What I found was that the rubber cement pickup was doing a great job of removing all of this, the paint on top of the wax here, and it wasn't removing the paper anymore of the darkness, but that's not what I'm seeing here. Let me see what happens with the Prismacolor. No, that's better. That's more of what the effect that I expected to see. I wonder if the reason is that the first time I was going with a really gunky end like that. I wonder if a really gunky end that I haven't picked all these little nubbins off of tends to tear up the paper more. Well, it looks like I thought I had figured out all the little permutations of this, but there's still a little bit for me to figure out. So I've used this and this to kind of get rid of that paint on the top. But then I discovered one other thing that blew me away. Take a look at this. As it turns out, not only did it remove the paint that was on top of the waxy pencil marks, but it also has removed enough of the waxy pencil that I can now paint on top of these marks. And so remember, before erasing, just the when it was just the waxy pencil on there, the watercolor would not adhere to it. But after I use my eraser on it, I can come in here and tint these. And I never thought I could do that. So that is my new discovery. And I think this is going to be really useful for me. I now know that I can come in and if I put my pencil in, before I put my watercolor down, I'll be able to erase out a bunch of those lines and then be able to add into it the whatever color I want on those lines. And that's a new toy. That's a new toy for me. I didn't know that I would be able to do that.
So Jack, would you use this trick to do like clouds or sunsets where you have colors that you don't want?
So
where would you be? Where would this be particularly useful?
Let's put some water on the lake. For a big cloud, no, because on a big cloud there'll be just too much of this stuff showing through. But on anything that has texture, like wood texture, texture of sunlight on water, I'll bet that this would work really well. So I'm going to just kind of come in here. And I'm going to draw so I put down a couple of washes of water here. You can see because there's pencil underneath it, that pencil is showing through. While that's drying, I'm going to do some wood texture over here. And when I first put my marks down, they don't really show up very well. Now I'm going to let both of these characters dry, lift that out, and then it's going to allow me to really kind of rework into that more. I could try to hit this with my hairdryer right now, but I don't know if the hairdryer will change kind of the degree to which the wax sticks to the paper. But just so that we are, because I'm feeling impatient, I'm going to give that a try. So it's my hope that this will not have, that the hairdryer won't have made that stuff adhere to the table more. Oops, sorry. That's looking cool. It's over here in the wood.
Was this a simpler technique than using Frisket? Something that we could use in the field much quicker?
Yeah, this is, I would use this in a different, sort of similar to how I would play with Frisket, but this is, it's a different beast. Frisket, I think, is a little bit more harsh. Frisket also messes up your brushes. Now I'm going to that dry a little bit more. And down here in the water, I'm going to be able to paint over these marks if I want to, and I can't really do that if it was just the, if it were just wax there and I hadn't erased it. So this idea of using the eraser with the colored pencil effect in there is new for me. I always used to be shy of using that colored pencil because I knew that once it was down there, I was locked into it and I wouldn't be able to work over it again. But that's no longer the case. While that's drying, I can go back over here. See, now I can start to draw on top of this thing. And I already have a base coat in of the color that I want. And so now I'm able to just go along and draw on top of that. But I have a underlying coat of color that I've already established. So what I like to do when I'm doing things with watercolor pencils is to start them with some very simple colors, then blend that, kind of spread that color around. Then come back in later and and draw on top of that. But the final layer of details, I wouldn't be re-hitting that with water. I would have the final layer of information on my watercolor pencil things be with my pencils, because I don't want them to give me more of those surprise color changes. That's a little bit of my kind of new bag of tricks, new thoughts of thinking about kind of working with these pencils. For me, a couple of the really big takeaways are I now have a new way of getting lights into darks can allow me to do some really fine and precise stuff. The frisket thing that I bring with me, the masking fluid that I bring with me in the field, which is this, the Molotow art masking fluid. We demonstrated that during the class on nests. This one does not, it's pretty thick. So when I'm making marks and lines with this, it's going to be a big, thick line. There you go, like this. And that this is going to allow me to do stuff that's a little bit more subtle, feels a little bit less harsh. I like some of this sort of kind of organic looking highlight there in the water. And that would be, I think, a little bit too harsh with the art masking fluid. I also like knowing that when I'm working on an opaque, when I want to get white that is opaque, that I did not expect this. I expected to prefer the Faber Castell, but I like the way that the Prismacolor pencil puts down those marks better than the Faber Castell. That was also kind of a neat insight for me. And that's just a few kind of new additions to my bag of tricks. And you can also see the application of this to, if you're continuing to work drawing your bird nest. I know that I now am excited about having just the idea of being able to draw with my pencils, put watercolor on top of that, then erase the watercolor and the pencil off the paper. That for me that's going to open some more doors for some creative play. And I think especially in the area of textures, that's going to be useful. I could see taking my pencil and drawing in some blades of grass on a grassy field. Hitting that with watercolor, having the resist of the watercolor of the pencils, create sort of some of those grasses, being able to erase them then, and then making them brighter where I wanted to, or being able to then tint them another color. That's great. That's great. So this is just a new area of play for me. And again, it's just tinkering.